this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, so I'm not really sure where we're going to go with this, but let's just get right into it. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows coming your way. So, if you enjoy the information, the discussions, the topics, the lectures, the guests, and the hosts on the other network shows, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month. Every membership counts, and we do need your support to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on my favorite topic, which is the maladministration by the IRS and the DOJ and the lower federal courts for the last 50 years, the maladministration of the income tax, you want to find your way over to taxfreedom.com, start reading and get educated, and if you need help or know anyone that needs help answering an IRS letter or the Department of Justice and courts, civilly or criminally, you need to find your way over to irszoom.com and pick yourself up the document templates you need to defend yourself from those charges if you're dealing with the DOJ, or answer the IRS if you're dealing with them administratively, because they can't cite the law because it's been an unconstitutional system since World War II, and the Supreme Court, just like it got rid of Roe v. Wade, just like it got rid of regulatory deference under Chevron, just like it got rid of affirmative action under Students v. Harvard, it has gotten rid of the income tax in the Moore decision. Not because of its ruling on the mandatory repatriation tax element, but because of their constitutional review of all of the taxing powers that they provided on pages 5 through 7 of that opinion, which comprehensively reviews all of the taxing powers granted by the Constitution, their status today, together with the limitations applicable to each. And what they write in that decision on pages 5 to 7 destroys the IRS's ability to assess the tax based on gross income under Section 61, and destroys the DOJ's ability to argue it's a tax you owe because of the 16th Amendment, and it destroys the lower court's argument that it's a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And when one stone falls, they all topple over in succession. Because as soon as there's no direct tax, there's no basis in gross income. The basis has to be impost, foreign taxation, duty, exported goods taxation, or excise, the taxation of commodities, licenses, and corporations. When the direct tax argument goes away, so too does the tax on American labor, because there is no taxation of the Americans' labor performed in the 50 states by right rather than through the enjoyment of any taxable privilege. That is not taxable to the federal government by impost, duty, and excise. Your labor was only taxable if it was a direct tax on all sources of gross income. And that way they get around the limitation of only being allowed to tax foreign exports, imports, commodities, licenses, and corporations. There is no constitutional authority to tax your right to work. And we're going to get into that more in the show in a bit, but I think I'd like to talk a little bit about, current events, just a little bit. First of all, on the economic front, oil, of course, as I mention every show, is still down there around $61 a barrel, and it came down because Trump shut down the Houthi interference in the Red Sea shipping. So even though you wouldn't think there's much the president could do to affect the price of oil, there actually was in this case because Biden just let the Houthis operate. And that threat of losing a tanker or to the Houthi interference kept the price of oil high because there's more risk involved. So when Trump shut the Houthis down, That brought the price of oil down, eliminated the risk, and the world is benefiting from it, and I think it's going to go even lower. And of course, he also shut down the other Iran proxies running amok. And part of that is the price of oil. I've said before, when the price of oil is $60 and lower, it's very difficult for Russia and Iran to make enough money to fund anything other than their own country's existence. So he's dried up Iran's ability to fund the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, which have all kind of gone quiet under Trump and will probably remain so because they know if they make noise, he will shut them up permanently with another mother of all bombs or 69 more tomahawks, which is what he did to the Taliban and ISIS the last time he was in office, and I think they all remember that, and that's why they shut up. So that's looking good because, as I've said, energy is everything. It's your whole economy, it's jobs, it's your ability to expand, it's your transportation, it's your shipping, it's everything in your economy is based on energy. When energy is cheap, the economy will boom. When energy is expensive, people can barely afford to get to work and keep the lights on, and everything suffers and goes into slow recession and not depression if the energy policies making the price of energy high aren't reformed and the natural forces of supply and demand allowed to bring the prices down, because they will. There's lots of oil, and it shouldn't be above $60 a barrel. That's only done through artificial manipulation and interference by the government, which of course would include war or terrorism. So, and of course it's now coming out just like we knew it would. And of course, if you were listening to this show for the last 5 years, I told you 5 years ago, Biden was mentally senile and physically decrepit. He was not only incompetent, he was incapable. Turns out he probably had cancer when he was elected, and the whole administration was, just like I told you 4 years ago, completely co-opted by the socialist cabal that he took on to run the White House. And that's that cabal that's been running the country under Biden for the last 4 years. He doesn't even know what he signed. Doesn't even know what he signed. I think Trump is right. He was probably never for an open border. He just didn't know what he was signing. And he signed it all on day one, which is proof. He was mentally senile and physically decrepit right from the start. Incompetent and incapable. And what did the media do? Did they tell you the truth? Oh, no. The only person telling you the truth was me. And maybe a few other cable hosts, and maybe a couple of hosts on Fox News. But for the most part, the mainstream media has been lying to you and covering up the extent of the catastrophe being perpetrated by Biden economically, socially, and nationally, and globally. He's been covering it up. He was completely decrepit and unable to perform, and they just kept, oh no, he's sharp, he's running circles, we can't keep up with him. And that's why we call a lid on the day at 11 a.m. Oh, God. So now they're writing books about how it was a cover-up. The people that covered it up are now trying to get rich, exposing the fact that it was covered up. Oh my God. Oh my God, just mind-boggling. The people that covered it up now want to write books saying, oh, it was covered up. But not by us, it was done by Biden's team. We didn't do it. Lying pigs, that's what they are. Lying pigs. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that I don't usually talk about. I don't normally bring sports into the competition here. But there's a couple of things happening that I think are worth mentioning. One, Caitlin Clark is back on the court for the WNBA. Again, if you haven't seen her play, it's worth a watch. She's a lot of fun. It's a great show. As for the NBA, well, gee, so far in the playoffs, there hasn't been a whole lot of really good games. We're down to the finals. You got the Oklahoma Thunder versus the Minnesota Timberwolves, and Oklahoma blew them out by 30 points. But on the other side, in the East Coast, you got Indiana versus the Knicks, and this looks like it might be fun to watch. Last night's game was just wild. The Knicks ran off like 6 3-pointers in the last 2.5 minutes to come back from 14 points down and tie the game on a shot that bounced off the back of the rim, straight up about 8 feet high, and then came down through the hoop without touching anything but string with 0-0-0 on the clock. That was after being down by like 15 points with 2.5 to play. The Pacers just ran off 3 after 3 after 3. This guy, Nesmith, was just infallible. He scored 20 points in the fourth quarter, and I think 18 of them were in the last 3 minutes. So the Pacers won in overtime. They had come out red hot in the first quarter, shot like 9 in a row, and the Knicks kept close. And then the Knicks kind of took over the game and led from anywhere from 5 to 17 for most of the second, third, and fourth quarters. But as I said, in the last 3 minutes of the fourth quarter, Indiana just lit it up and roared back, tied the game with no time left, and then won in overtime. So, if you are interested, that series looks like it's going to be pretty good. And Indiana's been playing real well. They took Cleveland apart in 4 games, and I think everyone expected Cleveland to win. They had the second best record, I think, in the NBA after Oklahoma, who looked unstoppable against Denver in the 7th game. I mean, they just made Denver look terrible. A lot of people were picking Denver and Jokic to win that, but Oklahoma just crushed them. So, there's good basketball on. Caitlin Clark actually is playing tonight, and she plays on Saturday against the New York Liberty, which won the title last year, so that might be fun to watch. They won their first game by 35 points against the Chicago Sky, and probably should have won the second game against the Atlanta Dream. They lost that 91-90 because the Indiana coach, I think she made the wrong call. Kelsey Mitchell been hot the whole game. The play was Kelsey from the 3 or driving to the hoop, kicking to Caitlin on the 3 for a shot. And they ran it through, I forget the name of the girl. It's the one who just became number 3 on the WNBA scoring. But she had a terrible game. She missed shots from inside half. She doesn't look like she's on her game yet this season, or she's gotten old and lost it. But they ran the play through her under the bucket, and it got shut down, knocked away, and they lost by a point instead of having a good shot at it. So anyway, a little bit of basketball. All right, where are we? A couple of minutes here to go. So, where do we want to go here with 2 minutes? As I've been explaining for the last several months, the federal income tax is basically dead. The writing's on the wall. I don't understand why nobody else in the country understands this or is willing to talk about it. But I assure you, what the Supreme Court wrote in the Moore decision terminates the IRS's ability to continue assessing the tax in the way that they have since the end of World War II, which is when the constitutional fraud really started with the victory tax, which was an unconstitutional direct tax on the labor of the American people to fund the war effort. And it was imposed directly, collected by the employer, so it was collected indirectly, but it was imposed on the labor of the citizens of America. And before that, the labor of the citizens had not been subject to taxation, other than the decision in the Stewart machine where the court said that you can tax the employment for Social Security purposes. And of course, that's a perverse decision that was extorted by Roosevelt with his threat to stack the court if they didn't allow his second Social Security Act to exist. So that's kind of what we've been under ever since, the perversion of the taxation of employment under the extortion of the president of the judicial branch. Because just 2 years before in Alton Railroad, the Supreme Court ruled that Social Security was outside the orbit of congressional power. So how in 37, 2 years later, does it suddenly become okay? Gee, I wonder if they reacted to the extortionate threat of Roosevelt. So the whole thing's been a fraud since, what, 1937? We'll be back in 5. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into it. As I was saying when the commercial break came up, in 1935, in Railroad Retirement Board v. Alton Railroad, the Supreme Court declared that a program, Social Security specifically, taxing the labor of the American people was unconstitutional because it was outside the orbit of congressional power. And then in 1937, somehow it becomes okay to tax the labor of the American people. Of course, that was after Roosevelt threatened to stack the Supreme Court with 6 new liberal justices, one for each justice over the age 70, if they didn't allow the second Social Security Act passed by the Democrats to stand. So the court was extorted into allowing the taxation of the labor of the American people. But wait a minute. Didn't they start taxing all of that in 1913 with the income tax? What do you mean in 1935 it was unconstitutional? They imposed the tax in 1913. Oh, well, wait a minute. In 1913, what they enacted was the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913. The tariff is one form of an impost, which is one of the 3 forms of indirect taxation authorized by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which taxes foreign activity. Imposts, tariffs, tax foreign activity. Foreign persons in America, foreign imports in foreign places, like the territories of possessions or a foreign country under a tax treaty. Tariffs don't tax domestic activity unless it's conducted by a foreign person. And the Supreme Court told us in Brushaber that the scheme of taxation adopted by the Tariff Act was one of collection of the tax at the source. And we've seen in the statutes that the tax enacted in 1913 was collected by withholding agents who were required to withhold the tax and lawfully authorized to withhold the tax and collect the tax only from foreign persons. And that's why it was unconstitutional in 1935 under Alton labor to tax the labor of the American people, because the original income tax did not do it. It implemented an indirect scheme of collection of the tax at the source, where any person, company, or individual making payment to a non-resident alien or a foreign company was required to deduct and withhold money as tax from the payment to the alien, the foreign person. And then that tax collector was made liable for the payment of the tax that he has collected from some other person. There is no liability for tax on your own labor or your own work or your own earnings. The income tax is collected on all sources of earnings of foreign persons. That's the withholding agent, and defined in law at 7701A16. That's the same 7701A at 1 where the term person is defined for use throughout the code. A16 defines the withholding agent, who is the income tax collector created in law under the 1913 body of law, subtitle A of Title 26, chapters 1 through 6 of that title. Subtitle C came 32 years later in 1945. It implemented the same indirect scheme of collection of the tax at the source, but this time they created a new class of collectors called the employer. And the employer doesn't have specific authority over citizens, but he can get it through the citizen's permission provided on an allowance form. So the first set of tax collectors, the withholding agent, that existed from 1913 to 1945, had no legal authority to collect the tax from citizens because it was not a domestic tax. It was a tariff collected from foreigners. And in 1942, they shifted gears. They passed a new law, the Victory Tax, which is a 2-year war revenue measure to fund World War II. Now, that was unconstitutional, but if you objected, what are you, a Nazi or a Jap? So nobody objected, and they got away with it. And when that that law expired, Congress probably looked around and said, holy smokes, nobody complained. We got away with it. And we paid off 90% of the war debt in 2 years. We can't let this power die. But they knew it was an unconstitutional power that they had imposed, a direct tax on citizens, and that they had only gotten away with it because of the war, and that without the war, they would probably not be able to do that again on a permanent basis. So they didn't. They let the victory tax expire. And they let the American people think that the withholding was now associated with the income tax from 1913, to which they had never been subjected before. But World War II apparently wiped out America's collective memory. Nobody remembered that before the victory tax, they weren't subject to the payment of tax on their salary or wages. Nobody had to file, and nobody could collect the tax from them. So in 1945, when the victory tax expired at the end of 44, they passed a new body of tax law, Subtitle C, chapters 21 through 25. They created a new collector, the employer, who again, as the collector, never pays tax out of his own pocket. He only turns over what he's collected from other persons, and the shifting of the burden of the tax out of the taxpayer's pocket, because it's only the collectors who are the taxpayers. The person from whom the tax is collected is not the taxpayer. They think they are because the money that pays the tax comes from their pocket, but they are not the taxpayer because they have no legal duty to interact with the Treasury to pay the tax into the Treasury. The only party or person with the statutory legal duty to pay the tax into the Treasury is the person, the party, made liable for the payment of the tax. And guess who's made liable? That's right, the withholding agent, the collector. He's liable for payment of everything he's collected from foreigners. And the employers are liable for everything they've collected from employees. That's Section 3403 for the liability of the employer, an indirect liability that lets him shift the burden of the tax out of his own pocket into the pocket of the employee from whom the tax is collected. Which is exactly the same thing that the withholding agent does with the foreign persons. Both collectors are the only party made liable by the statutes in the subtitle the collector was created under in the era that tax law was imposed. The withholding agent in Subtitle A in 1913, the employer in Subtitle C in 1945. The difference is, in that Subtitle A, there is a tax imposed on the foreigners. But in Subtitle C, there's no income tax imposed. There's a tax imposed for Social Security, there's a tax imposed for railroad retirement, there's a tax imposed for federal unemployment, but there's no tax in Chapter 24. Unlike all the other chapters and subchapters where there is a tax imposed, the first code section is rated tax or tax imposed, but in Chapter 24, the first code section is definitions. And the next code section, 3402, is collection of the tax at the source by allowance. What happened to the tax imposed? Why on earth would I allow the collection of a tax that is never imposed? Because you're duped. You're duped from age 14 forward. You're duped into becoming a serf, a peon, a used material human asset. Because we don't have a tax system, do we? There's no tax imposed, and none of the money taken out of your paycheck goes into the United States Treasury as required by law. That's Title 26, Section 7809, which says every penny collected as tax must be deposited in the United States Treasury on a daily basis. Now, regulations modify that daily requirement to some regular cycle, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and most employers send in their withheld collected taxes on a quarterly basis. So that means on December 31st, your employer should have already sent in all of the tax withheld and collected from you through the course of the entire year. And that same code section, 7809, that requires the tax to be deposited into the Treasury, also requires a receipt certification to be made showing the name of the taxpayer, the amount of tax paid, and the account number to whom the tax is to be credited, which is your Social Security number. So how come on January 10th or thereafter, how come on April 15th, you have to file a tax return to pay the tax? It was collected from your paycheck under a law that requires deposit of the tax to the Treasury. You shouldn't have to file to pay the tax. It's already been paid by virtue of the law requiring its deposit after collection. Why don't you have a credit for tax recorded at the Treasury? Is it possible it's not tax? And that's why it doesn't go to the Treasury? Remember, there's no tax imposed. You just allowed them to collect your money as though it were tax. They know there's no tax imposed. So the question next is, if it's not going to the Treasury, where is it going? Where is it going? And if you want to know where it's going, all you got to do is turn over the back of the last check you sent to the IRS and read who cashed it. Because if it was tax that you sent in on April 15th with your Form 1040, what it will say on the back of that check that you wrote is deposit to the U.S. Treasury. Who wants to bet that's not what it says? Who wants to bet there's nobody in the country except an ATF participant who can produce a check that says deposit to the U.S. Treasury? What does it say instead? What it says instead is paid to any FRB, Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. Why is a private corporation cashing your so-called tax check? Excuse me? I didn't hear? Why is a private corporation cashing your tax check instead of it being deposited in the Treasury as required by law? Because it's not tax. The law doesn't apply. And they know it's not tax, which is why they've routed it around the Treasury to their creditor, the Federal Reserve Bank. You've been subscripted as collateralized labor for the $38 trillion in debt Congress has unconstitutionally run up to the monopoly on currency and credit given the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. The whole country is working for the private bank, not the government. You're being forced to service and labor the debts owed to the bank. It's a peonage system. There's no tax paid to the Treasury. There's no tax deposited in the Treasury. It's not a tax system. It's a labor collateralization peonage plantation system resurrected from the 11th century. With the master on the hill that all the little peons have a plot of land on the manor. But every year at harvest time, the overseers come around and tell the peons how much of their annual harvest they have to turn over to the master so that he can pay his whores, his gambling buddies, his court, his munition suppliers, and, of course, the debts he owes to the king, his master. So in our analogy, the peons are we the people, the overseers are the institutions, the master on the hill is Congress on Capitol Hill, and the king, whose debts are being serviced by the whole peonage plantation system, is the Federal Reserve Bank. And your job is to labor every day of your life for the benefit of the bankers. Not you, not your family, not your vision or belief of God, the bankers. You serve man, not God or any ideal of government. I think I hear the second commercial break coming up. This is Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and I'm just going to go ahead and get right back into this. As I was saying when it came up, we don't have a tax system here in the United States. We have a peonage debt collateralization plantation system from the 11th century, where the American people have been duped into believing they're being taxed when in fact they've been reduced to the role of a peon whose only purpose in life is to service the debts of his master so that his master can continue recklessly borrowing and spending to enhance the quality of his own life. And the hell with the peons and how much they have to suffer to fund the master's opulence and decadence. And that's where we're at. And that's pretty obvious. But I talked earlier about how the dominoes all start to fall under the Supreme Court's ruling of Moore et Ux v. United States. That's 602 U.S. 572, 2024, if you want to go look it up. The important part is pages 5 through 7, where the court gives us the comprehensive review of all of the constitutional taxing powers, together with the limitations applicable to each form of taxing power granted, direct and indirect. So the first thing that we have to establish in order to get the dominoes start toppling over is what is it that the IRS does within its operational practices in terms of how does it assess the tax? Does it assess the tax because you were involved in some activity involving alcohol, tobacco, firearms, a license for such, or petroleum fuels? Does it assess the tax on the basis of you enjoying a corporate privilege in earning money? Does it assess the tax on the basis of you being a foreign person? Or you being involved with the exportation of any goods? In other words, are they assessing an impost on foreign activity, a duty on exported goods, and excise on commodities, licenses, and corporations? No? You say, no, that's not you. You're not foreign. You're not exported goods. You're not a license or a corporation or an alcohol, tobacco, or firearm product or petroleum fuel. Well, then what would be the basis for taxing you? That's right. The IRS says the basis is gross income under Section 61. You earned money. And why is that a basis outside of the imposed duty and excise taxing authorities that only existed before the 16th Amendment? Oh, that's right. The 16th Amendment, they argue, created a non-apportioned direct tax on all sources. So that makes gross income sources subject to the direct tax. And the IRS, in fact, teaches this. On their website, they have little cartoon animations with quizzes and tests that you can take to make sure you understand their version of the law. And they actually have the unmitigated gall to be teaching on their website that income taxes are direct taxes under the 16th Amendment because they can't be avoided and everybody has to pay their own tax. I mean, they're literally teaching communism. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto. That's what the IRS is teaching. They think they're teaching constitutional law because, of course, the Department of Justice and the lower circuit courts have been in seditious rebellion for the last 55 years. And actually, the Supreme Court's been involved in that rebellion itself by not reining in and halting the unconstitutional application of the tax as a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment, which the IRS invented out of regulatory deference, making up the application in a direct manner under regulatory liability that isn't based on statutory liability. But Loper-Bright eliminates their ability to argue that you're liable because of the regulation for Section 1. The statute, tax imposed, doesn't make anyone liable. It imposes a rate of tax on certain classes of persons, married, unmarried, heads of household. But where's the liability? There isn't any. There isn't any because it's not a direct tax. It's collected, and the collector is liable. It doesn't matter that there's a rate of tax imposed on married persons. If they can't collect it from you, you're not subject to its payment. Unless you don't understand the law and file a tax return, then you'll be subject to the self-assessment that you made yourself liable for through the signature on the bottom of the return, even though there wasn't any liability in statute, and there was therefore no requirement to file the return. And even if there was, which return was required by law? Did you look that up? Do you even know how? Do you think Form 1040 is the required return? Surprise, it's not. And it never was. It never was. And there is no liability for tax in the name of the worker because it's a collected tax. Collection of the tax at the source is the indirect scheme. And there's the classical shifting of the burden of the tax from the pocket of the collector that pays it to the pocket of the person from whom it is collected. And the collectors never pay tax out of their own pocket. They just turn over what they've collected from other persons. Exactly the same way a store is made liable for the payment of the sales tax in a state. The store doesn't pay tax out of its own pocket. It simply turns over what it's collected at the cash register as tax in addition to the cost of the goods. And they segregate the funds. Taxes go over here, revenues go over here. And once every quarter, they send in the tax revenue collected. It's indirect, paid by the collector. And they have, point to, a dozen different circuit court decisions, all proudly and unanimously declaring it's a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And the Supreme Court has let this constitutional fraud go on in circuit court precedent since 1980 and in operational practice at the IRS since 1960. So what's happened? We can definitely verify that they claim it's a direct tax based on sources of income allowed under the 16th Amendment without limitation, because the 16th Amendment says they'll have power to lay and collect tax on whatever source derived without apportionment and without proportionate imposition under the census without regard to any census or enumeration, which of course are the two requirements that apply to direct taxes. So they are absolutely enforcing the tax, alleging it is a direct, non-apportioned tax on all sources of earnings, including the right to work your labor and fruits of labor, even though the federal government has no nexus or connection to any sources. Rent, interest, dividend, alimony, tips, commissions. How would they have a nexus connection to any of those sources under impost, duty, or excise? It doesn't exist. That's why they've had to argue it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. There's no other way to get there. There's no other way to get to the tax, to a taxing power that lets them tax your interest, your rent, your dividends, your wages, your salaries, your compensation, your alimony, your commissions, your tips, your annuities. None of this is taxable to the individual citizen in the 50 states. Never was. There is no tax. They're applying it as though you were foreign, or in a territory or possession, or a foreign country under a tax treaty, which is where Section 61 actually comes from, and which is what 1662 actually applies to. Both gross income and adjusted gross income have no publication outside of respect to the tax treaties they're enacted under. Section 62, adjusted gross income, is used in the European treaties, and Section 61 is what was used in the Canadian tax treaty that expired 30 years ago in 1993. It existed for 75 years, and it's been the basis for the perversion of the tax from the indirect tax collected from foreigners to a direct tax on all sources of earnings of American citizens. Essentially the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. One of the means by which the state seizes control of the resources to produce: factories, labor, capital, and land. They're enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, not constitutional taxation, and they're using it as a peonage system to fund their reckless borrowing and running out of the currency. As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation, and with it, the quality of life of its people. And you've got a bit of a taste of that the last 4 years under Biden, who ran it out and deteriorated the quality of life by increasing the price of energy and food. And if you didn't notice, you're either wealthy or brain dead. So what did the court do in Moore that changes any of this? Well, what the court did in Moore is they said specifically income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and the 16th Amendment. They specifically label the 16th Amendment as part of the constitutional foundation for indirect taxation of income under Article 1. Impost, duty, or excise, which doesn't reach labor. Not only do they declare that income taxes are indirect taxes, making it impossible to argue from henceforth that it's a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. No, it's not. It's an indirect tax. Not only do they say it's an indirect tax, they say direct taxes still have to be apportioned to the states for payment. That means the non-apportioned direct tax they've been enforcing against people in the courts for 75 years has all been done unconstitutionally. Every single bit of that direct tax enforcement needed to be apportioned to the states. It can't be enforced against an individual. If it's a direct tax, it can't be enforced against an individual because the 16th Amendment did not do away with that limitation on direct taxes. It only did away with that limitation on the income tax as an indirect tax, which was never subject to the limitation of apportionment as such. Indirect tax is an indirect tax. It's only subject to the limitation of uniformity. That's geographical uniformity, which means it has to operate in every state with the same force of law as it operates in every other state. But geographical uniformity is discriminatory against the American people, and this ability to use tax brackets dates to decisions of the Supreme Court in the 1880s where they held that tax brackets are based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the articles of commerce and commodities subject to taxation, and to discriminate against the licensed person, the corporate person, and the foreign person based on how much money was realized as a function of enjoying the privilege possessed, that of incorporation or of licensed or being allowed to earn money as a foreign person in the country. So graduated taxes go to the power of Congress to be allowed to discriminate. But what power does Congress have to discriminate against the American people as opposed to the corporate person? Could they have one tax of 100% for Jews and 10% for Christians? Or 90% on whites and 5% on blacks? Or 10% on the elderly and 70% on the young? Or 70% on the men and 30% on the women? Well, under this theory of geographical uniformity, they could, and it would all be perfectly fine, provided all the Jews in New York and Christians in Florida, California, Texas were treated the same. It would be perfectly fine to treat them all differently as long as it was geographically uniform. And that's absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And wealth is one of the things they're not allowed to discriminate on. That would take you right to income. The whole thing is a fraud. Graduated brackets don't apply to citizens. It's unconstitutional. The direct tax doesn't apply to citizens. It's unconstitutional. Indirect tax doesn't apply to labor. It's unconstitutional. The courts lack the subject matter jurisdiction to act.